Guys, we do have them now. Let's get right to the line now and bring in Dan Murphy from ESPN, staff writer there who's covered this story, all over this story. Dan, on a list of things you wake up and read in the morning yesterday, that was not one of them for me. Just the shock, first and foremost, of the allegation against Mel Tucker yesterday. What did you make of this as a whole?
Yeah, this is some understanding might be, and ended up writing about it late Saturday night, but it was certainly surprising, and I think that the nature of this case one that raises a lot of eyebrows.
Hey Dan, the question for me is more with the university and how they've handled this. I mean, because at this specific university, you'd feel like at least you want the process and everything to go the way it should be. Yesterday, Alan Haller said he heard about the allegation in December. He got the report, the independent report, in July. Why yesterday? What was the reason that the suspension came down yesterday and not in July, let's say?
There was a lot of confusion after yesterday's press conference about what Alan Haller and the rest of the MSU administration knew and when. And just to clarify, they learned that there was a complaint about Mel Tucker as of last December. They learned in July that complaint had reached the end of its investigative stage. According to Michigan State's spokesperson and other people that I've talked to in the past 24 hours, what they didn't explain clearly last night was that they didn't know any of the details of the complaint, including who the complainant was, or that Mel Tucker had admitted to having a sexual encounter over the phone, and said, his story, of course, that it's consensual. That he had at least agreed that those facts were true. They didn't learn that until they read about it in the newspaper on Sunday morning or around that time. And so that was when Alan Haller mentioned having new information on Sunday that led to their decision. Because of the way that these processes are set up in the Title IX world, the direct boss of somebody who's been accused of a sexual assault or sexual misconduct violation is intentionally withheld, so that in this case, right, if Alan Haller knew what the complaint was about and who was involved, there is a potential that somebody in that position would use that information to intimidate a witness or to kind of change the outcome of an investigation. So they intentionally set this up so somebody in Haller's position and somebody in the university president's position doesn't know the details of one of these cases until it's fully resolved. Which this case is still open, but because they learned about things through the stories reported over the weekend, they had some new information, namely that Tucker had admitted that this happened, right? That parts of this were no longer in dispute. And I think that's the new information they refer to as why they decided to suspend him without pay this weekend.
How in the living hell do they leave that out of a press conference then yesterday?
It's a good question. I think these are complicated processes. I'm trying to give them the best benefit of the doubt here. They are doing their best to try to respect the confidentiality of everybody involved in the process, both complainants and the coach. And I think because of that, they were probably pretty tight-lipped. They didn't take many questions. Right, last night there was a very brief press conference. They took 3 questions that seemed to be from predetermined reporters of who was going to get to ask a question, and then they hustled out the door without any follow-ups. And unfortunately, I think some of the lack of clarity came from how brief that was, and there was no opportunity for us to ask questions to make that more clear until a few hours later when we were able to follow up with some spokespeople that work for the university.
Talking to Dan Murphy, staff writer for ESPN, great stuff on ESPN.com. And again, that doesn't feel, Dan, the interim president yesterday said this was, Teresa Woodruff said this is a new MSU. That doesn't feel like a new MSU to come in, not really state the facts out in front of the public, and then take 3 questions and scurry off. Do you think that was... Well, what do you make of that to begin with? Just that 3 questions?
Yeah, the lack of transparency was a little bit frustrating from a reporter's seat. I think they're doing their best to try not to let this open case get played out too much in the public. I think that's their reasoning behind that. I don't know that it's the best approach, but you mentioned sort of the new MSU versus the old MSU, and there were a couple of things yesterday that raised those questions. We should say that even though Alan Haller didn't have the full details, or none of the MSU administration had full details, there was nothing stopping him or anybody else from suspending Tucker just on the knowledge that he's under investigation for an alleged sexual misconduct violation. That alone, if you've got the most powerful and richest man at Michigan State who's under investigation for that, there's an argument to be made for suspending him immediately, even if you don't have the exact details of what happened here. And then, the last bit that I think is worth mentioning is they talked about not being the old MSU, and yet their first call was to bring back the old football coach who left 4 years ago amid some unanswered questions about his own reactions to some sexual misconduct issues that happened with the program while he was there. So that doesn't exactly scream that they're totally turning the page on some of the issues they've had in the past.
Hey, Dan, forgive me. I just want to make sure I get my facts straight. Did Alan Haller know that Mel Tucker was just under investigation for something, or that he was under investigation for something that was sexual in nature?
I believe he would have known that the complaint was filed as what's called their relationship violence and sexual misconduct policy. Yeah. So he knew that it was somewhat sexual in nature, and he knew that it was from a third party that worked with the university, right? He would have known not who Brenda Tracy, the complainant, is or her name, but he would have known somewhat the nature that it wasn't a direct employee, but it was somebody who worked with the school.
Dan, what happens next come October the 5th? What happens then, and what did he do after that? What's the next steps?
Yeah, so the investigator, who was an outside investigator hired to look into this, has completed her work, and she's recommended that the Title IX office should hold a hearing. And this isn't a criminal proceeding, and so this is a somewhat imperfect analogy, but essentially the discovery is over, and the trial will be held on October 5th and October 6th, I think were the dates that they gave. And after that, then the person who's presiding over that was usually somebody from the university. Will make a decision, and I don't know. They didn't say, they didn't answer questions yesterday on whether if Mel Tucker is found to have violated the policy. They didn't say for sure that he'd be fired or for sure that they would react one way or the other. So we'll have to wait and see what gets determined at that hearing, and then decide what Alan Haller and the rest of the university leadership want to do as a result of it's worth noting that one more thing we're noting is this happens to fall in Michigan Week. This is 72 days investigation ending and the date of the hearing. These are numbers worth questioning of why this process takes so long. The policy Michigan State has stated online is that from start to finish, these policies should typically take between 90 and 150 days. And again, this was filed last December, right? So we're going on close to 10 or 11 months before this is going to be fully resolved. And they haven't really answered questions as to why this case is taking so much longer than a typical one.
Hey, when Mel Tucker was brought in for Michigan State, they gave him the richest contract for a coach at that point. And there are stipulations in his contract. Do you think that he has violated those? Do they get out of paying him all this money? And do you think he'll ever coach Michigan State again?
It's a good question. I certainly don't know everybody in those positions to make those decisions well enough to know whether or not he'll coach again. He has a clause in his contract that discusses moral turpitude, which is basically a lawyer's way of saying don't embarrass us. And so I think if he's found to have violated these policies, a lawyer from Michigan State would certainly argue that they have cause to fire him without having to pay. I think it's $70+ million left on his contract at this point, and I'm sure Mel Tucker has a lawyer who will argue that. And that's something that will probably take years to sort out and a lot of dollars to figure out what they owe him and sort of what their responsibility is there based on that contract.
It feels like a big mess, Dan. Feels like a big mess. Really appreciate your reporting. Really appreciate you hopping on with us. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thank you.
You got it. Follow Dan on Twitter at Dan Murphy ESPN. Really following this story really, really well, and you get the up-to-date and the latest information right there from Dan.
Do you think he's coaching again?
Never.
Right.
Never.